It's been 80 years since the first traditional style comic book was published here in Canada. A Hamilton historian is among those helping an effort to mark the occasion. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton-Niagara region for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us from Hamilton with the fine print on that. Hey, Justin.
Hey there.
All right, Justin, with a Twitter handle like Mr. Lois Lane, it was only a matter of time before we started talking about comic books. And of course, for people who are not familiar, your Twitter handle is sort of a tribute to Lois Lane, a fictional character in the Superman comics, Superman's love interest, but more importantly, an award-winning journalist. So very fitting.
Exactly.
But we're going to be talking about Canadian comics today. Not much is known about its history. So maybe get us started. What do we need to know?
So this period that we're talking about, wartime Canadian comics, really started, like you said, in 1941. And the reason for this, as the reason for many things in Canada, is because of bureaucratic, essentially. So during the war, there was this act called the War Exchange Conservation Act that banned the import of non-essential goods. And included in those were pulp magazines and comic books. So suddenly the American comic books like Superman and Batman that had really started kicking things off in 1939 were no longer available to Canadian kids. So what that meant was that Canadian publishers had an opportunity. And almost right away, they started making books. So by 1941, the first Canadian traditional style floppy comic was published. And when I say floppy style, I mean kind of like this. So a traditional, like what you think of as a book now, that it's bends, not the first comic, but the first in that style that we all know and love today.
Now, I understand these comics are very rare to find now. I want to pull a cover of the Better Comic #1. Tell us about this.
So Better Comics #1, this was where it started. This was the first book with the cover date of March 1st, 1941. It was created by a publisher in BC. His name was Vernon Miller, and his publishing company was called Maple Leaf. And it was a story that included some interesting characters like the superhero Iron Man, not the Iron Man that you might know from Marvel today, but this Iron Man who was like an ocean-dwelling superhero who fought Nazis and crime, and as well just some other anthology stories. So it was also notably mostly in black and white, and that was actually the case with most of these wartime comic books that started coming after that because it was a lot cheaper to print.
Now, I'm sure there are going to be some comic book collectors who are watching this who are like, okay, wait, hold on. How do I get my hands on them? And I'm just curious, is there sort of a price tag on these comics as well?
That's hard to say. I don't know about how much they would actually go for if you were able to buy one, because they are so hard to find. Like the comic book historian that I talked to learn about all of this, Ivan Kukmarek, what he was telling me was that with some of these books, there's fewer than 10 in existence. And because the industry came and went so fast, like after the war, when American books started coming in, all these Canadian publishers folded. So in some cases, there's fewer than 10 of any of these books in existence, and people didn't really save them in the same way or even know about them. So they're rare, but they don't have the same prestige as a 1940s Batman or Superman comic might.
Now, Justin, you spoke to Ivan for this piece. Let's have a look at what he had to say.
Well, if we take a look at Better Comics #1, it started off with stories that seemed to come more from British annuals that were out at the time, boys' annuals and girls' annuals, dealing with adventurers, tinkering scientists, cowboys, detectives, but not the garish superheroes that were south of the border, like Superman, Batman, and all, Captain Marvel and everything. Though Better #1 introduced the first Canadian superhero. He was called the Iron Man. And he was actually a denizen of the ocean. He came from a civilization that had been sunk and now lived in a bubble city somewhere in the South Seas. And he was more a clone of, say, the Submariner that we know today in Aquaman. He would come up and fight the Nazis and help out people against crime. And that was the Iron Man, invented by Vernon Miller, who was the architect, the BC architect behind Better Comics #1.
Now, you obviously are a comic book aficionado. I'm sure you loved that conversation with Ivan there. Was there anything that struck you about what he was saying there?
Well, it was interesting to hear. One of the things he told me was that how the Canadian comics took, like he said, that tradition a little bit more from the English side and that sort of annual rather than the American side. So while there were still superheroes like that Iron Man character that he mentioned, books were maybe a little bit different than what you might think of. And I mean, I'm always telling people comic books are a medium, they're not a genre, but we do know mostly superhero comics. Those are some of the most popular selling comic books. So it was just interesting to see that Canadian books at that time were taking a little bit of a different approach than American books were.
Now, Ivan also says those comic books could be considered an early social network. How so?
Well, this part was really fascinating. Essentially, a lot of comic books, ever since they started, had sort of letters to the editor in the same way that newspapers or magazines would, and they would have places where people could write in and publish things. And what Ivan says was that a lot of the books in this time period were actually encouraging readers from all across the country to write in, but also to become pen pals with one another, or to do things to help the war effort, like collecting scrap or doing paper drives. And so they were actually, in a way, connecting people across the country. There were publishers in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, but people all across were reading and were actually able to interact and connect because of these books.
Now, I understand Ivan's sort of taken it upon himself to preserve this rare moment in Canadian comic book history. Tell us about that.
Yes, he says it's his mission to teach more people about these wartime comics. And so part of what he's trying to do is actually to reprint Better Comics #1 in sort of a collector's format. And so he says he's in touch with the family of Vernon Miller, who's the one who published the book, and with some archives. And basically he's trying to get access and put this book out to the world so that people can read it again.
Now, I understand there is a society called the Society for the Promotion of Canadian Comics. Who are they, and how else is Ivan and that organization trying to preserve this legacy?
So this is a collection of comic book enthusiasts and academics. Ivan's a member of the group, and they're working in order to try and teach more people about this history and to just promote Canadian comics more generally. And so part of an effort for that is, for example, they worked on a magazine, Sequential Canadian Independent Comics Magazine is a book that publishes information about indie comics in Canada. They did a special history issue as part of this effort, and they're also working towards an academic conference.
I do want to end off on this one question. Now, of course, we all know that Justin is pretty synonymous to comics. That's how I know you. But did you know about this Canadian history before, or is this also your mission to preserve this legacy as well?
Yeah, this was all new to me, so I'm very excited to be telling more people about this. I do consider myself maybe an amateur comics historian, but most of what I know about isn't the American comics. And despite doing a lot of modern reporting on Canadian comics and people making books today, I didn't know about this 1940s history, and I'm very glad that I do now.
Well, Justin, I want to thank you so much for that history on Canadian literacy and comics. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.